So welcome everyone, and thank you for being here to learn from Fred Van Liew with his long experience with restorative justice around the country. I'm Kathy Gorley, and I'm representing Friends of Restorative Justice. Until recently, we called ourselves Friends of Restorative Justice of Washtenaw County. However, we became a 501c3 nonprofit a few months ago, and we dropped the Washtenaw County part of our name. So now we're just Friends of Restorative Justice. And we're working to make restorative justice known and available everywhere in Michigan and probably beyond. Friends of Restorative Justice, along with the Dispute Resolution Center in Washtenaw County, are the primary sponsors of this series of events, which are designed to educate about and expand the use of restorative justice. Fred Van Liew is our latest presentation in this series. First, I'd like to explain a little bit about what restorative justice is to those of you who may be new to this. Well, I don't know if there is anybody who doesn't know, but just in case. Friends of Restorative Justice learned about it from some of our members who belong to Shalom Community Church. Janet Reedy was one of them. Shalom is a local Mennonite congregation. Restorative justice has been practiced by Mennonites for 50 years or more, although restorative justice itself has been in use much longer by indigenous communities in North America and other continents. Shalom church members showed us a play called Tough Case. Tough Case demonstrates the use of restorative justice after some teenagers vandalize and steal things from an older woman's home. At first, the older woman is afraid to return to her home. She's also afraid to meet the perpetrator of this crime, the young man. But eventually, she does decide she's going to come to a restorative justice conference with him. There, she has a conversation with him, and as a result of that, she's no longer afraid. She realizes he's just a kid. Together, as what happens to make things better going forward. He returns the items that he stole, and he ends up repainting her whole house. These positive results probably would not have happened in the traditional criminal justice system. Restorative justice focuses on the needs of the person harmed. Our current system focuses on the person who caused the harm, whom it tends to isolate and punish. Restorative justice works to repair the harm and strengthen the relationship between the person who causes it, the person who is harmed, and the community. Rather than pushing people out, it tries to repair the ties people have to each other. When we first discovered restorative justice about 10 years ago, we found it was already being used in Washtenaw County, although in a limited capacity. Circuit Court Judge Tim Connors had set up a peacemaking court, modeling it on restorative justice principles that he had learned from a tribal community in northern Michigan. Judge Connors has sent and still sends cases to our local dispute resolution center where restorative justice is done if possible. In 2024, Washtenaw County is in a better place with respect to restorative justice than it was 10 years ago when we learned about it. It is now being used by our county prosecutor, several of our judges, the Ann Arbor City Prosecutor's Office, by community members and organizations, and to some extent in our schools, including at the University of Michigan Student Conflict Office. Many people have been trained in facilitating restorative justice conferences or circles. We want to continue this trend. So I have a few technical issues to convey before we proceed. As you know, this meeting is being recorded. Afterward, a link to the recording will be put on our website and the Dispute Resolution Center's website. It will also be emailed to all of you who are registered. Belinda, the format tonight, Linda will introduce our speaker, and she has some predetermined questions to ask him. If you in the audience have questions, you may put it in the Q&A section as they occur to you. These questions will be taken as time permits at the end. Lastly, if you have not already muted yourself, please do so. Next, I will turn it over to Belinda Doolin. She is the Executive Director of the Dispute Resolution Center, our partner in this series of educational events.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks everyone for being here this evening. I'm Belinda Julin, the Executive Director of the Dispute Resolution Center, and we're really honored and excited to be a part of tonight's event. I want to note that this is Fred's fourth visit with us here in Washtenaw County. This education and relationship began in 2013. So thank you, Fred, again for being here tonight. The Dispute Resolution Center is a community dispute resolution program, and we're also a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is to provide conflict resolution services that are affordable, restorative, healing, and accessible to the community. As Kathy mentioned, we work very closely with our peacemaking court, and most recently, we've implemented a restorative justice program with our local county prosecutor, Liew. And we are honored and really excited to keep learning and growing our service to give the best service that we can to the residents of Washtenaw County. Our guest of honor tonight is Fred Van Liew. And as I said, he's been here, this is his fourth visit with us. But a little bit of background on Fred. Fred is a lawyer out of Drake University Law School, and he has served in various capacities in the legal community, including the Assistant Attorney General of Iowa, the state of Iowa, a felony prosecutor in Polk County, the Attorney Office of Des Moines. He also worked with the Legal Aid Office as a supervising housing litigation in Polk County as well, and a clinical instructor at the Drake Law School. In the early 90s, Fred returned to the Polk County Attorney's Office as the first assistant prosecutor, and he developed several restorative justice programs that spanned over 20 years. And he'll talk some about that some tonight. After he retired in 2010, Fred continued his work in the restorative justice arena, and he works with the criminal system as well as the juvenile justice systems. His work is evidenced in Polk County, in Des Moines and Cumberland County District Attorney's Office in Portland, Maine, as well as other institutions, and he's worked with probably thousands of individuals over the course of many years in providing the service. So without any further ado, I'd like to begin the conversation with Fred. And again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And once our dialogue has ended, Fred will take questions from the audience. Okay? So welcome, Fred. Thank you for being here again. Yeah,
Thanks for the introduction. I know you didn't intend it, but it makes me feel really old. So
I did not intend that at all.
I know you didn't intend that.
I think it's not that you're old, but you're highly seasoned and favored in this work, and we're honored and thrilled that you're making your fourth visit with us here in Washtenaw County. We've learned so much from you in previous years, and as you and I have spoken, our work is beginning to grow, and I really appreciate you sharing your insight and wisdom with us. So let's start at the beginning of all of this. Tell the audience what prompted you to get started in restorative justice when you were the assistant prosecutor.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
In the mid-'80s, when I was a prosecutor for the first time with the Polk County Attorney Office, which Des Moines, the capital of Iowa, Polk County, Des Moines, and the county seat of Polk County. And I went through the original traditional mediation training. That was like 85, 86. And I was fortunate to be able to use it at legal aid and in private practice. But in 91, as you mentioned, I went back to the Polk County Attorney's Office as first assistant, and I oversaw roughly 95% of the cases that came into the office. And quite honestly, it's pretty depressing to see the machinery of the system, so to speak, in operation at that level. But in the summer, in June of 91, and I'll never forget it, I got a letter from a very good friend, a minister. We had done work around homelessness in the mid 80s. And he said, Fred, you got to find out about restorative justice. And I'd never heard of it. It didn't quite make sense that would, from my experience as a prosecutor, that you would put restorative and justice together in the same breath. I suppose that's why it was intriguing to me. And I don't know if it's the case that is documented in the film that you spoke about, but he included in the letter the keynote address of the annual Ontario Canada Restorative Justice conference. I think that's what it was. And I'll never forget the fellow who was the keynote speaker said, in 100 years, we will have a restorative justice system in Canada. And I was absolutely taken by that, in that somebody has quite a vision and isn't suggesting that it can take place overnight. And for me, I thought, well, I'd like to be part of that, and I don't have to get to the end game, because I'll be long dead before those 100 years are up. So he didn't tell me about Howard Zehr, but I learned about Howard Zehr before there was even Google somehow. I don't know how, really. And I got his book, Changing Lenses, which came out in '88, I think, initially. Read it and was radicalized, I suppose, you might say. And part of my duties as the first assistant was I was the attorney in charge of the Neighborhood Mediation Center, much like you are, Belinda. And we had 25 very active mediators at the time. And so I ordered 30 books, and we had a read over a period of about a month. And we said, we've got to do this thing. Whatever this thing is, we've got to do it. I got a hold of Howard. He was very, very friendly. And we've since become very good friends for many years now. But at the time, he didn't know me, and I only knew of him from his book. And he said, I'd love to come to Des Moines. Pretty busy. I think it was probably his book tour that kept him busy. And so he suggested, get a hold of a colleague of mine, Mark Umbright. And some of you may know Mark or his work at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work. And Mark was kind enough to come down and do the very first restorative justice training in the state of Iowa, I'm convinced. It was a 3-day training on, back then, it was called victim offender mediation. Okay. That terminology has gone by the wayside, and for good reason, because victims don't think why would you mediate with the person who caused you harm? But at the time, that's what it was called. We ate up that training. And the fortunate thing about being in the system and being first assistant is I could do pretty much what I wanted, I talked to my boss about it, the elected prosecutor, and he said, well, Fred, try it, just don't end up in the newspaper. Okay. Which all good elected prosecutors don't want to end up in the newspaper unless it's favorable. And so he just said, sort of keep me informed. And we started doing them on an ad hoc basis. And I would, obviously, I didn't look at all 95% of the cases that I was responsible for, but I would, in a sense, cherry pick. This was the summer and the fall of '91, and find cases where I thought, oh, this would be good. This would be good. And maybe perhaps the victim would want to meet with the person who hurt them. And I got a hold of the public defender's office, and one by one, I convinced them to, on select cases, allow their clients to participate. And there was a lot of skepticism early. I mean, how can a lawyer let his or her client talk about the crime they committed before the case was over, But I encouraged the public defenders who were interested, curious, to just sit in on it. And that was not the only turning point, but that was a significant turning point, was public defenders sitting in, keeping their mouths shut, which was a challenge for them. and just observing this incredible thing, right? This incredible thing, process, whatever you call it. And so we just sort of flew under the radar for a couple of years, doing many. I suppose the first year maybe we did 100, the first full 12 months, and more the second year, and I think the third year maybe 94. A judge I knew well, an associate district court judge. In Iowa, we have at the trial level associate district court and district court. And associate district court judges oversee probably 95% of all criminal cases. And Judge Egley said, I want to talk to you, Fred, about this thing that I hear is going on over there. It's always this thing. And so I had lunch with her, and she said, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And she started not really ordering, but I don't even know what you call it, coercing something. But she started sending cases our way on the associate district court level. That went on for a year or two. And then the district court judge, the chief district court judge, called me up and said, Fred, what's this thing that's going on over there? It sounds like you're doing social work. You're a prosecutor. And so I went over and had lunch with him. And after an hour and a half, he said, oh, okay, I'm going to put it in all these sentencing orders that if there is a victim, and this runs contrary to what some restorative justice purists think should happen, but he put an order that still exists 20, almost 30 years later, that, and I can't quote it verbatim, but basically, if there's a victim of the offense and the victim wants to meet with the person who caused the harm, that the defendant shall meet, and there should be a discussion about restitution. And the important thing was not so much the restitution language, but and any other relevant matters which opened the door to allowing for a true restorative dialogue. Was any other matters, okay? And once that happened, that might have been 95. We really got legs under us. In Iowa, we have I forget what it is in Michigan, if you have a board of commissioners or if you have a board of supervisors at the county level. But anyway, whatever it is, in Iowa, we have a board of supervisors, and they provide almost all of the funding for the prosecutor office. And I went with them one at a time, always to lunch. You always try to sell things over lunch. And I explained it, and I said, victims vote. And I would say within a year or two, we were getting $500,000 a year to fund what is now perhaps 8 full-time restorative justice positions in the office that do various things, and to provide on an annual basis a line item to pay facilitators. And so that was in the 90s. And in 2005, I wanted to see, I was absolutely sold on it. And it was the only reason I stayed as a prosecutor was because of restorative justice. And whether this is kosher or not, I facilitated a lot of cases, even though I was a prosecutor. Nobody seemed to mind. And anything from shoplift to sexual assault, robbery, I probably did 5 or 6 first-degree murder cases. And for those of you, I imagine, I have no idea what people's faith is or lack thereof, but it was the most spiritual part of my life, was being present, being witness to these conversations. And so in about 15 years, and these were all adult crimes, okay, not juveniles, as normally communities start with juvenile cases, but I didn't oversee the juvenile cases. I oversaw the adult criminal cases. So I would say 98% were adult cases. And as I said, the full range from simple misdemeanors to Class A felonies. And in 2005, I made a lateral move with a colleague who ran the Juvenile Bureau because I wanted to see if it was possible to look at, as Howard suggested, Howard's there, to look at the juvenile system and the young people that come into it through a restorative lens rather than a punishment lens. And could you have an impact on a system? Okay. So I took over the Juvenile Bureau Chief in 2005, and by screening cases, the nice thing about being a bureau chief is a juvenile court officer can't get a filing done could not get a filing without my permission. I had to prove the filing of a delinquency petition and child welfare petitions, child need of assistance petitions, and so they had to come to me. And I screened the cases through a restorative lens. And within about a year, and this is a county of 450,000 at the time, we reduced juvenile court filings by 50% by screening through a restorative lens. And so that went on for when I retired in 2010. Now, the what do you call it? Cautionary tale. Well, I'll introduce the cautionary tale. But within a year of my leaving the office and doing work outside with the system, but outside the system as an employee, juvenile court filings went up 160%. The pendulum swung back way too far, and then community activists got involved. It was a wild time in 2011, 12, and 13 when the community many people in the community sort of got up in arms over what was happening to the juvenile justice system when everything appeared to be going well. And so that was my experience as a prosecutor. Since leaving 2010, I've done a lot of workplace conflict work, church conflict, worked with universities, colleges, et cetera, always using restorative practices, not typical mediation, but restorative practices. And so it's kept me excited about being with people in that way. And so for many years, the first 13, 14, 15 years, I only facilitated restorative dialogues. I'd known Kay Pranis since 1991. Many of you know Kay, and she may have come to Ann Arbor. And we were friends, but she never facilitated restorative dialogues, and I never was a circle keeper. And we would tease each other about that. So finally, in like 2009, I took her 3-day circle keeping training at Eastern Mennonite, where I was taking classes, and fell in love with it. And so for the last 13 years, I've, depending on what the need was, I've facilitated dialogues and circles, and sometimes a hybrid of those, in a variety of contexts. Presently, I have my own business, Restorative Practice Associates, and I have a couple of major contracts. One is providing restorative services to the Cumberland County District Attorney in Portland, Maine. And the other is providing those services and training a lot of people now in Polk County. And an interesting thing for those of you interested in politics, 2 years ago, I guess it was the spring of 2022, both in Polk County and in Cumberland County, the elected prosecutors, both elected in 1990, retired, and or maybe it was 20, I forget when it was, and 2 women running on restorative justice platforms were elected. fantastic. It's just fantastic. And so it's with those two women who both brought me on board in Portland to build restorative justice and within the office in the community, and in Des Moines to resurrect restorative justice. So they're not in the same place. So it's interesting to go back and forth between two offices, and one's getting started and one is wanting to return to when it was sort of a golden era, I guess. So anyway, that's a brief history, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you, Fred. It's a very interesting history. It seems like over more than a couple of decades that you have seen this work expand and maybe in some areas contract, but really the spread of this, and as you have just mentioned, we're seeing candidates in Washtenaw County who also run on a restorative justice platform. So this language is becoming infused in our political landscape and throughout the many different systems. I want to pick your brain a little bit about data. So as the director of a nonprofit who relies on getting funding, data is always at the top of the list of things to talk about. While I see the casework being so much more than extrapolating that data, I think the stories that come out of restorative circles or dialogues are just so profound, and there's so much more than what we can capture in a database. However, that is part of the charge for me. How do we capture the data? So I'm just curious, given your longevity in Des Moines, Iowa, doing this work, what resonates with you in the conversation around data? Are there data factors that you would recommend that we must capture, we must analyze, or not? And I also want to add to that question the concept of recidivism. That is a guiding principle for some of the system leaders on, are we reducing recidivism when we do restorative justice? So both questions, or either question for you. What's your response to that?
Well, you've opened the Pandora box. My first boss, I would say, the second boss, 91 to 2010, did not keep data. Okay, we kept data within the Restorative Justice Center, but not recidivism data. And prosecutors generally don't want to do that. I did have a PhD sociologist come in 98, 99 and do a pretty good study of 200 cases. I gave him access to our files, and Professor DeWild, over about a 6-month period, tracked down both what the system calls defendants and victims, and did interviews with them, and produced a really, really well-written paper that I don't know if I still have. He wasn't looking at recidivism so much, unless that was offered up by a defendant. But he did document satisfaction or lack thereof. And I guess what really comes out, and it's 20 some years ago, so is that a couple of things. Easily 95% of victims and offenders who go through a restorative process, at least of those 200, reported a high level of satisfaction. And what I found really telling was that victims would report that they have a much higher appreciation and sense that justice, in the real sense of the word justice, was done as a result of participating in a restorative process. And that in the absence of that participation, they weren't too fond of how they were treated. And generally the treatment is being ignored by the system. And that does not happen at all, obviously, as you know, in a restorative dialogue. So for those years, there wasn't data kept that would satisfy present day funders so much. With both district attorneys I'm working with now, we track every single case and are also collecting data on age, gender, race, etc. I did have another PhD person about 3 years ago do a smaller study, but similar to the one done in the late 90s, and found the same results. But the recidivism part, I mean, we could talk quite a while about it. I always sort of, I'm chagrined when people bring it up, as if a single session should have a significant impact when it comes to recidivism. We don't ask treatment centers to prove that they're effective. We don't ask probation departments to prove that they're effective in reduced recidivism. So it's bothersome to me that that those of us who do this work have to somehow demonstrate, reduced recidivism. So I can't give you much more than that, other than it bothers me. And at the end of the day, all I care about is the conversation, not the data.
Yeah, it sounds like I'm inferring in the discussions that we've had prior to tonight, but it sounds like the standard of recidivism in making decisions around funding or the efficacy of the program, of a restorative program, might be too high of a standard for practitioners. And that standard are you suggesting that that standard is not applied to other aspects of the legal system, like probation department?
That's my experience. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure to clarify that. I appreciate you saying that, Fred.
It is. I've not seen it applied to the myriad treatment centers and programs and God forbid you apply it to prisons, right? How much are you reducing recidivism, prison,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
well, only 50% come back, so.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Fred. It's like we have to have better control of that narrative instead of letting that standard be applied to us.
And I think one thing it suggests, by the way, Belinda, is be careful who you ask money of, Just because
we're learning that the hard way.
I helped start the Portland Center for Restorative Justice about 10 years ago or more. And we were doing work totally free of charge for the Juvenile Division of the Department of Corrections. And then they came along with money, but they wanted us to jump through those hoops, and we turned the money down,
Sounds very brave, but I understand how you can be led to that.
Yeah,
and
it's hard to stay, in a sense, pure if you have your funder, in a sense, dictating what it looks like,
Exactly. Yeah, thank you for that. I want to go back to something you said on the start of this conversation. You talked about you said something about public defenders or defense counsel working with them. And I'm just wondering, from a bird's eye view, you've spent so much time in this arena, working now across the nation, consulting with a number of other institutions. Have you seen an impact on the legal stakeholders and how they operate? Do they move differently once restorative justice has gotten implemented into the legal system? Are they talking to each other more? Is there more cooperation overall?
That's a great question. The simple answer is yes. Perhaps the more nuanced answer is you got to have one or more people who are the connectors. They generally don't seek each other out, but just a quick example. So the contract I have with Polk County now, which started in September, I've reached out to juvenile court services. Well, the first thing I did, they weren't doing restorative justice. They did way back when I ran the juvenile bureau, but they lost positions and it wasn't a priority any longer for them, nor was it a priority for the prosecutor's office after 2010 for more than a decade. But about 3 months ago, I met with the head of juvenile court services and we talked about it. He remembered my work from several years earlier. And I said, can I do a circle with your senior staff? So we did a 3-hour circle with the director and 11 or 12 of the senior administrators. Um, um, and that turned it. And I frequently say this, and it goes way back to something Kay Prentice told me years ago, which is, Fred, if you do work with schools, you better start with the administrators, because if they bring you in to just train people to do circles, for example, in schools, but they themselves don't experience the power of being in circle, it won't last. It won't get any traction. And I've seen it both ways. And so you take 3 hours with senior administrators in a juvenile system, and at the end they're all teary, and then you got a meeting out of your hand. So subsequent to that circle, we're embarking on. I trained 15 people just last week, a day and a half training to facilitate circles for juveniles in the juvenile court system. We're already getting a steady stream now of cases for dialogues with young people, and that was not happening. It's not, they don't just, at least in my experience, they don't just start talking to each other. I mean, there's got to be somebody or a core group that's persistent in connecting them, and getting them to come to meetings and hopefully get them in a circle, so that they can feel the power of it, and so they can say, yes, we want these for the people that we serve. So, but yeah, there's much more talk, I think, between institutions now than there were, at least in the early days for me, And that goes back to the cautionary tale that I think it's important to touch on. So if you're in a DA's office, you have an awful lot of power, to wield, for good or not so good. And I was fortunate to have a boss who really didn't understand restorative justice, but let me do what I wanted. And so I could do what I wanted. And I created 10 or 12 restorative programs, including the Restorative Justice Center itself. But what I did not do, perhaps it was because I was naive. One, I'm sure it was because I was naive. I did not involve the community. And I don't mean just involve the community in terms of having facilitators. I had facilitators, but I didn't involve the community so that they felt they had a stake in justice. And so when I retired, there was nobody to push back against the unraveling. I call it the great unraveling that caused me to be depressed for 2 years. And so that was a hard-earned lesson that I'm trying to rectify with both district attorneys that I'm working for now, is how do you, prosecutors come and go, they either retire or they get beat. So how do you maintain and grow when there is a change at the helm, and that's something that it's hard to convince the elected official who feels like they got a mandate that they need to be thinking beyond their own term, their own tenure, if they really believe in this work. So I'm in conversations with both of my bosses now about that and what can we do about that. And that's one reason that I'm really pushing hard the use of community surrogates when a victim does not want to participate or there is not a victim. And so I can talk about that a little bit later, but the community, the community, who is the community? The community is the people that are on this Zoom. And and other people too, people in schools and elsewhere, churches. But you, at least from where I am, you have to move outside. The prosecutor has to move out into the community, and not just to give speeches, but to say, we want you to know what's going on. We want you to be a part of it, as a facilitator, as a surrogate, or whatever. So anyway.
There are a couple questions in the chat that I'm going to pick up now because they relate to comments you've already made.
Okay.
One of them is to talk more about the dialogues with the young people that you mentioned. What were those dialogues about? Where did you, and I know working with a school can have its own struggles, just being in a school building, the bell is ringing, very frequently, it feels. Kids are moving around all the time. So can you just say more about those dialogues with the young people? How did it unfold, and what else can we learn from your
Yeah.
experience?
Well, I mean, they happened in different venues, so to speak. So when I took over the Juvenile Bureau in 2005, it really disturbed me how often a juvenile court officer would want me to file a delinquency petition on a kid that had very little, if no record, but was a problem in school. And that was really disturbing. And so I went to the Des Moines school superintendent, maybe 2006, and I said, listen, I will put free of charge a facilitator at each of the 6 Des Moines high schools, one full day a week, every week, week in, week out. Whatever you've got for them, they'll facilitate. And I took on Lincoln High School in Des Moines, 2,200 kids, went every single Tuesday, got there at 8:45, and I might be done by noon, I might be done at 3, I might be done at 5, okay? And suspensions were reduced by about 50% by having the community, so to speak, in the school as a resource, but as a third-party neutral, not as part of the school administration. And so that made a big difference. So doing dialogues in schools was a significant factor in reducing the number of the filing of delinquency petitions. But then we did and still do dialogues with kids that have been filed on, or they've been referred to juvenile court, and there's been what we call anyway an informal disposition, which means they're under the supervision of juvenile court, but they're not in court. And so they take a place across the board. When I retired in 2010, a local advocacy group called Amos, which was about 30 churches, now it's about 50 churches, came to me and said, Fred, you know what's happened since you retired? No. Well, petitions have gone up 160%. And the people who came after me took away the mediators from the schools. Okay, one reason petitions went up. Yeah, so that was a big thing, and just did not encourage it. And so delinquency petitions went up 160%. So we came together, these churches or people representing the churches, and trained roughly 100 people to facilitate school dialogues, conversations. And I was pleased to hear that Justice for Our Neighbors has become a nonprofit. Back in 2013, 14, 15, when I was community organizing, there was the challenge of this very, very active and effective advocacy group pushing back against the system, against the police, against the prosecutor's office, but also saying we want to provide services. It's hard, and I said you've got to bifurcate. You've got to decide which one you're going to be. You can have both, but they can't be together under the same umbrella. And they finally reached that conclusion and split off, so to speak, so that there's a nonprofit just for the school mediations. It's called Let's Talk. And then the existing advocacy group still exists as an advocacy group, but not as a service provider, so to speak. So Yeah.
Great. Thank you for giving us more on that. You also talked about doing a circle with the staff of the district attorney's office. Are you able to share the kinds of questions that you ask? We're many of us on the screen are desperately trying to engage our system stakeholders and systems leaders, and I think doing a circle with them is a great idea, and just want to get some insight. How do we broach that? Or maybe what kind of circle questions do you think we should ask?
That's a good question. Well, fortunately, both prosecutors that I'm working with want their staff to think restoratively. So I've done with both offices individual trainings, not circles initially, individual trainings on restorative justice and processes with different aspects of the office. So I've done that with the victim liaisons in both offices. We have 18 legal assistants in the Des Moines Polk County office, and I'll be doing 2 half-day circles with them. 9 in each circle, 18 is too many. And in March, I go to Maine in a couple of weeks, but when I come back in March, I'll be meeting with small groups of prosecutors. There's about 50 prosecutors in the office, and over about a 3-week period, I'll be meeting with 4 or 5 of them in sort of a circle fashion to talk to them what the benefits might be for them as prosecutors to think more restoratively, to move cases to a more restorative place. But what sort of a typical circle, I guess when I did the circle before Christmas, the half-day circle with the juvenile court administrators, I did sort of a hybrid of what I call a justice circle. And many years ago, it just dawned on me, and I don't know if it's correct or not, but it dawned on me that the way to have people understand a restorative approach is to begin with injustice. Okay. And so we explore in the circle, for example, once we've done the usual mindfulness moment, introduction of the talking piece, the centerpiece, guidelines, all of that, and some storytelling. Then we move into, when did you first know that there's this thing called injustice? And it sounds like a simple question, but it's really, really powerful. And everybody has been the victim of an injustice. Now, they're not all the same in terms of magnitude. But everybody has been the victim of an injustice. And it's a very powerful question, or questions like that are very powerful questions when you're in a circle and you may have people that are on opposite ends of a particular spectrum. Okay. So for example, after Trump got elected in 2016, I was asked by a Unitarian church in Portland to do a series of Bridging the Red-Blue Divide circles. Not real easy, and still not easy, okay? And you don't start talking about politics right away with anybody in a red-blue circle. So where we started after sort of the usual tune-up stuff is, what's the first time in your life or can you think of something you witnessed or something that happened to you or your family that looking back now 30, 40, 50 years later, you realize in some ways shaped your thoughts now on politics, ideology, etc. And it's a very powerful question, and that approach is powerful because you have people answering the question as children, okay? Before they knew there were such things as Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, all that. Before they knew that ever existed, things happened to them. Okay. And so you're hearing these people that you really maybe don't even want to be in the same circle with, sharing their stories as children. And it's sort of hard to, I think it was Dr. King said that you can't hate somebody whose story you know. And so to get those stories from a young age really helps you move into the deeper questions that you want to get to later on. So that's what I typically do with systems people, is something like a justice circle where we explore injustice. When did you first know there's this thing called injustice? When did you first know the world's not a fair place? And then we'll move into the question or two later is, if they talk about an incident, what if there'd been a restorative response to what happened? And then that allows us then to move deeper into what is restorative justice, and what are the benefits, and what's it look like in individual situations, et cetera. But and yeah, that particular approach never seems to fail in terms of having people really stop and pause and think about how we do things, how we do justice.
Yeah, I love those questions. I'm a person who likes to collect questions, and I've made a note of those too for myself. I
Yeah.
appreciate that. I do have a couple more questions I want to get to, and then I'm going to pull more from the chat. It looks like a few things have come there. But I want to go back to the notion of the community. You talked about community members, like the folks that we have tonight, are critical to the restorative justice movement. And I agree with you, and I feel very strongly about that. But you talked about surrogates, folks that represent the community member. Maybe the person who was harmed doesn't want to be a part of the dialogue, or there wasn't a clear victim.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about the role of a surrogate and what kind of preparation should we be thinking about? We're beginning to broach that conversation with our prosecutor. How do we utilize community members, which I think is another pathway to educating the community about this
you're
work.
so right.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's a way to radicalize them, quite frankly, in a way that's
Like that
palatable. Well, over the years, I've from time to time facilitated where we ask somebody if they were willing to be a surrogate for a victim. Okay, but this is different. In 2000, when was COVID? 2020?
2020, March of 2020.
And I was in the first year, latter part of the first year of my contract with the district attorney in Maine, and COVID hit, and he came to me and said, it's not the present prosecutor, but the predecessor, the present one, and said, "Listen, Fred, yeah, as you know, the court system's bogged down. Okay. We can't move cases, right? You need an open court in order to move cases. But crime doesn't stop just because the court stops or slows down." And he said, "Is there some way that you can, the thing that you do," they always say the thing that you do, could it somehow help us? And I said, "Well, tell me more." And he said, "Well, we have some cases that are so low, I'm just got to get rid of them. I got to get rid of them, and we have other cases we can never get rid of them, no matter, the court can be closed down for a year and I can't get rid of them. But I have some cases that are somewhere in the middle. And I'm wondering if you did one of your dialogues, that would be sufficient, that would be justice." Okay. And it took COVID for him to even ever think about that, right? So I said, "Well, tell me about the cases you're talking about." And he said, "Well, some are shoplift, some might be drunk driving, drug possession, whatever." And he said, "Many of the ones that I want to send your way, including like speeding 30 miles over the speed limit, which sounds like a traffic offense, but in some jurisdictions, including Maine, it's 30 and more over, and it's a crime, not a traffic offense." And I said, if there are no victims, or a victim doesn't want to participate, I suggest we use, and I never really thought about the term, but use a community surrogate. Okay. Somebody to represent the interest of the community, not the interest of the victim, but the interest of the community. And I said, he knew that I was with the Portland Center for Restorative Justice as well. And I said, I'll talk to my board members, but I bet they would be on board with serving in that capacity. And so it was June of 2020, we started doing them. We've probably done 500 of them in the Portland area since then. We've recruited people, word of mouth generally, to be surrogates. I do a training, usually 4 or 5 people at a time. And it's not exhaustive because to be a surrogate and represent the community, you just bring yourself. You know, there's nothing magic about it. There's no preparation needed. The only preparation is don't come prepared. You don't think you've got to be a certain way. Just be you. If you're a school teacher, you're a school teacher. If you're a social worker, you're a social worker. If you're a mom, stay-at-home mom, that's who you are. So you just bring yourself because you're representing the community. So when I was brought back to Polk County in the fall, the DA there, that was one of the first things she wanted me to do was I'd actually had her as a surrogate on a Maine case so that she would know what it was like. And she asked me to do that. So there's been a lot of things on my plate, but we've trained 30 to 35 people now to be community surrogates on these dialogues. And it's absolutely having an impact on the system. On the simple misdemeanor level, the adult criminal level, simple misdemeanors, we are, because of the use of surrogates, and we are moving toward having a really robust simple misdemeanor diversion program where you participate successfully in a dialogue with somebody from the community and your case is dismissed. That's it. Nothing else. And so we're right on the cusp of, we're doing the dialogues every day. We're doing these dialogues with facilitators. The core group of facilitators I'm using are people who've been doing restorative dialogues for some time, but not this kind of a dialogue. So I've trained a handful, and they're doing 8 or 10 of these a week. So now we're on the cusp of looking, okay, now how does it impact the system? Okay. The one thing I would say about these particular dialogues, I did not think I would enjoy them. I thought, oh, this is going to be boring, after, doing dialogues on robberies and burglaries and those things over the years. I love them. I love them because you're on a Zoom and people are where you find them. They can be behind the wheel of their pickup truck. They can be on the couch with their baby, on the back porch or in the kitchen table helping a kid with homework. And so you take them as you find them and you talk, and you do the, requisite intro about confidentiality. And I always say, those of us who do this work around the world, who truly believe in a restored approach, we don't label people. There's no labeling. The system does that. They give you a number, they call you a defendant or whatever people call you worse. That doesn't happen here. Because we don't label you, who you are as a human being is more important than the mistake you made. And we'll talk about that perhaps later on. But it's much more important that we have a conversation about who we each are as human beings, And so where were you born? Where did you grow up? Your family, your education. What do you like to do? What have been the challenges in your life? And because there's not a victim there, you have these incredible conversations with people about who they are. They don't minimize what they did. They don't, not only do they not minimize, that you see this transformation during the course of 30, 40, 50 minutes where, oh my God, I'm being listened to non-judgmentally. These 2 people here with me aren't telling me how I should live my life or what I should do different. They're here with me on my journey during this time. And it's quite an amazing process. On the surrogate side, it's an incredible education for them because they're talking with people that they rarely, if ever in their lives, have conversations with. And certainly they may see them at Walmart or they may see them someplace else and say hi or whatever, but they don't have a conversation with them. Never. And the facilitators themselves they love them because they're used to being in the difficult cases that are challenging and emotionally draining. And we you know this, Belinda. And here it is. They tell me it's so refreshing. I don't have to balance what a victim's saying with this person. I really get to listen to this person. And it's not and they're not given a free pass. We talk about accountability, what they were thinking, who was impacted, how they were impacted, how somebody's life might have been changed or not, how their lives were changed. What are they doing now so that it's not likely to happen again? We get into that standard sort of restorative justice stuff later on, but that's not where we start. And it's not at least halfway through before we ever get to that. And so I'm absolutely sold on it. It doesn't replace victim-offender dialogue at all. It's used only if there is no victim or the victim doesn't want to meet the person who hurt them, but allows many, many more people from the community to be involved. And it allows many people who are caught up in the system and treated as a number to feel like they're human, to feel human, to be treated like a human. And they will say that. And at the end, they'll say, nobody's ever talked with me like this. Nobody. They say, nobody has ever talked with me this way. And at the end of the day, or at the end of any given session, I only have one agenda, quite frankly, as a facilitator when I do them, is that at the end of the hour, they truly feel like they were respected. And I have to think that plants a seed, So
it sounds incredibly
I can proselytize about surrogate dialogues all day long.
No, it sounds incredibly powerful. And in fact, as a follow-up question, can you give us and
the surrogates don't get paid, by the way.
Okay, I was gonna say that's one of the follow-up questions.
No.
But someone is also asking if you can give us maybe an example of what the content that a surrogate brings to the dialogue. What do they say?
The surrogate doesn't have to bring content.
Okay.
The surrogate brings who they are as a person. That's it.
So they're listening.
They're listening. They're curious. Okay. They're curious. And so when they do speak, it's, oh, that's fascinating. Or, I'm so sorry. Do you mind telling us a little bit more about that? But they don't bring content. They just bring their life,
Okay.
Yeah. So they don't have to be trained at all to be a facilitator, The training is really to untrain them. It's to convince them they don't have to come prepared, that they can just be themselves. They don't have to, they're not playing a role. They are who they are, So it's an untraining rather than a training, And the untraining is just to convince them that who they are is all they need to be,
Another question around the surrogate has surfaced in the chat. If a person went 30 miles per hour above the speed limit, what would the surrogate talk about?
Oh, that's a great question. It's actually pretty easy. They'll say, thank God you didn't get into an accident. I travel that road, or my wife travels that road on the way to work, or I've got a grandson just learning to drive. If things had gone bad, it could have gone really bad. My grandson could have gotten killed, my wife killed, severely injured. And so it's not hard to reflect and get into a conversation about what could have happened. Okay.
Okay. Thank you for that example.
Yeah.
I'm going to pivot.
And the same thing with drunk driving cases, right?
Yeah.
Any of the motor vehicle cases that we happen to get, which aren't the majority, but there are many. Thank God things didn't go bad, And sometimes there are collisions, that we, I've done some fatal, motor vehicle fatality cases, but not on the Zoom.
Okay, I'm going to pivot a bit and go to the chat just to make sure we don't miss any questions from the audience. So it's noted here that one of the stumbling blocks that we have experienced in Washtenaw County in our implementation of restorative justice was guaranteeing the privilege for the participants so that they couldn't be charged with new crimes based on things that they said in restorative circles. How did you handle this in Polk County?
Well, that's a great question. And it goes way, way back to 91, 92, when a group of us got together and drafted a confidentiality statement that's been tweaked a little bit over the years, but pretty much still the same. And for as long as I was there, maybe 20 years, I may be wrong in the numbers, but maybe 6 or 7 times somebody's tried to subpoena the facilitator, will say, to testify. We always get a hold of the civil division of the county attorney's office, and there's never been a judge who has allowed that. The judge always quashes that subpoena. Okay. Now, that said, 2 years ago in the spring, I got subpoenaed for the first time on a Maine case, and somewhat of a serious case. It was a school board president who was stalked for about 1.5 years by a white supremacist because of progressive curriculum that was introduced into the school at the encouragement of the school district. And she did not want to meet him in person, but we did a 3-hour Zoom. And it was one of the few. It didn't go particularly well. And the standard I always have as a facilitator, I don't know what you think about this, it's not a legal standard, but when I report back to a prosecutor, I can't tell the prosecutor ever what was said, but I can say whether somebody participated in good faith or not. That's about all I ever say. Did they participate in good faith or not? And that has worked forever until this one. And my boss, so to speak, the district attorney, did not want to support the original plea agreement, which was called a deferred disposition. Okay. So there was a hearing about that. And I got subpoenaed. Thank God I was in Iowa. So I did it by Zoom. And I absolutely refused to tell the judge what was said by anybody. He was incredulous. How can you not tell me? I'm a judge. I'm a judge. This is a case in front of it. You have to tell me. No, I can't tell you. I've been doing this work for 30 years. I've never had a judge allow this kind of testimony in. And no, judge, I'm sorry, but I can't tell you anything. And he quite frankly did not know what to do, but he finally said, okay, we're done with you. And that was the only time in 30 years that I've ever had that experience. But we have confidentiality agreements. So even on the Zooms, on simple misdemeanors, when we send the Zoom invite, we send an attachment that lays out the confidentiality and any limitations there might be to it. And so that's just not a concern that I have. And in the rare case that comes up, you fight it,
Yeah.
Because as I told the judge, I said, you undo this, and we're going down a slippery slope. And of course, you didn't hear that, but that's the truth. We have to fight it if it ever comes up.
Yeah, thank you. Another question, and I agree with you 1000%, we have to fight it. And sort of have prepared myself mentally for that fight should it ever present itself at our center. We have another question. It says, it seems like restorative justice is primarily used for juveniles or low-level first-time offenders. You mentioned that your program didn't have those types of restrictions on eligibility, which is amazing. What would you say?
Never.
Yeah. What would you say to convince court actors who would prefer to reserve RJ opportunities for just for youth or for lower risk people or cases? So what advice do you give when we see programs sort of getting stagnated because we're looking at only youth or low-level offenses? How do we move our program to the more serious
you have to
things?
have you really have to have a conversation with them about what happens. And so many people that think about restorative justice think it's just for kids. And I don't think they're thinking about the needs of the victim. Okay. Which is where I'm not saying one's more important than the other, but having been a prosecutor for so long, I deferred to the needs of the victim, at least initially in any dialogue. And I've felt for all these years that the greater the harm, the greater the opportunity for transformation if there's a dialogue. Okay. And to deny a victim the opportunity to sit across the table from the person who hurt them, I don't care what the offense, that's an injustice, in my opinion, to deny them that. And so I don't know why people got fixated that this is just for minor offenses. Okay. I did one 2 weeks ago. Young woman, not texting or anything, but it turns out was absent-minded because her brother had been murdered 3 weeks before. Ran a red light, hit an older couple out for a Sunday spin on their motorcycle, and the woman had her leg amputated. Okay. It was an incredible 3-hour conversation that started out with, I wake up every single morning hating you. I will always hate you. I will never forgive you. To near the end, hugging the girl, saying, I will be able to forgive you. And I do not hate you any longer. So why do we say we're going to deny that opportunity? Look at the benefit to the victim who doesn't have to live with the hate any longer.
Mm-hmm.
It's a huge burden, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And to say there's no place in this for people who are carrying that weight because it's too serious.
Yeah.
I've had people, women, victims of significant sexual assault, who at the time of sentencing didn't want to meet, but would call me 2, 3, 4 years later. I have to meet the person who did that to me. I have to sit across the table from them. I have to let him know how he changed my life forever. Are we going to deny that woman that opportunity?
Mm. That's a lot to chew on right there, Fred. I think denying the person who was harmed the opportunity to do what they want to do,
Yeah.
to adjust the harm that they've experienced. I think that's a great reframing of that. So we have at least one representative here from Grand Rapids area, which is on the west side of our state. They are, I just happen to know that they're doing some restorative justice work as well. Has that person has placed a comment in the chat. In Grand Rapids, we do some restorative conferencing in motor vehicle accidents resulting in severe bodily harm or death. Simultaneously, there are also separate civil actions regarding these accidents. Any thoughts on the potential problems there? How the criminal act and the civil action kind of cross paths or
Well, they can
converge?
potentially cross paths, but I always make sure both sides have lawyers in those situations.
Mhm.
And I make sure that those lawyers have worked everything out in terms of confidentiality, and that nothing said can be used in any subsequent civil or criminal proceeding. Okay. So I don't worry about that as a facilitator. If I know the lawyers have worked it out, and we can move forward. Okay. Yeah. Because you're not there to resolve restitution in a motor vehicle fatality, right? You're not there. You're there to be midwife, in a sense, to a conversation that allows, whether you use the language or not, that allows for healing and closure. But you're not there to deal with those other matters, you know. So you have to make sure that the lawyers have taken care of that stuff.
Okay, thank you. So what kinds of legal outcomes do you see following your RJ interventions? Pleas, diversion, something else?
All the above. Yeah,
Okay.
all the above. Yeah, yeah. Sometimes they never get filed. Okay.
Okay.
You know, I just got a call from a Maine prosecutor last week. Fred, I've got a case. Really don't want to go forward. I could go forward, but I don't want to go forward. Can you do a dialogue? You know, and if it goes well, then I'll dismiss it. You know.
Okay. Okay.
And that's the thing. You have to, as an aside, you have to develop. All this stuff is about relationships, right? So you have to develop relationships with the prosecutor's office. You know, intimate relationships. You know,
Mhm.
and not be
Yeah.
selling this as a program. You know, it's not a
Yeah.
program.
Yeah, it's a way of being, and that's a hard
Maybe.
message to send
It is.
to
It
get
is.
and to get that system buy-in and shifting. And I think it's just a thing that will take time.
Yeah.
We have a question, and I'm going to say the person's name, Jerry. I may need you to help me understand or expand upon this question. Policing is in the forefront. Any comments? And I'm not sure, Jerry, if he's still on the screen. I didn't want to overlook your question, but I'm not sure.
Well, sure. I'm just curious that restorative justice has taken us in a entirely new path, and in some ways, we're also looking at policing and thinking of alternatives to it, and also sometimes people who are involved in as police could use some humanizing that restorative practices seem to allow. And I was just curious to know what your thoughts are, Fred.
Yeah, I love doing those cases. I frequently facilitate dialogues in cases of like assault on a police officer or interference with official acts, those kinds of things. And they're fascinating, you know, and I've had several in which we've done them and the officer has apologized and said, I went too far. I wish I could do it over again. You know, I should not have handcuffed you. I should have engaged you in a conversation, you know. So it's absolutely appropriate for those kinds of cases. And then I've also facilitated several police, what I call justice circles, police circles with half police and half young people of color. And they're fascinating. And the theme of those, oftentimes, when I generally do them, is respect. You know, what is respect? What's it feel like to be respected? What's it feel like to not be respected? And both police and young people have experienced disrespect, right? And it's they're fascinating circles, and they went by the wayside when I retired, and now we're bringing them back. You know, we're in fact got a meeting with the police chief in a couple of weeks about doing those again. So it's very appropriate to use a restorative process, whether it's a dialogue or a circle, to engage police. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there, just making sure there's no questions in the chat that I've missed. I don't think I missed any. Fred, I want to thank you again for your insight and your wisdom around restorative justice. I deeply appreciate it, and have appreciated the past gatherings that we've had when you've come to Ann Arbor and to teach us. And so I have appreciated that, and I appreciate it again tonight. It's just been wonderful to listen to you and to learn from you. And I've been taking notes so that I can craft my messages for the system leaders and stakeholders in our county. heartfelt thanks, and I'm going to turn this back over to Kathy.
Okay, thank you, Belinda. And thank you, Fred. I always learn a lot of good things and tell some of your stories over again for a long time. I still tell the story about the synagogue and the vandals and the rabbi and the wedding.
Yeah.
Anyway, perhaps I know we're talking about having you for a part 2 of this. I don't know whether that's going to be able to be arranged, but for people who are attending here, we may have an in-person session with Fred Van Liew, and you'll hear about that. As a future educational event, we're also thinking about having some kind of discussion about using restorative justice in cases of intimate partner violence. We have 2 local people who would be good on the panel who have agreed to be here. We'd like to get one more, somebody who has been doing restorative justice in intimate violence cases. So if anyone knows of an organization, we might have to go out of state, or a person who's doing that, please let us know. And you can contact us on the Friends of Restorative Justice website. There's a contact form. In any case, those of you who are registered, we'll inform you about our next event whenever that happens. The date's not determined yet.
Can I mention one thing when it comes
Sure.
to approaching people in the system? Well, this was a few years ago, but in Maine, before I started working with the district attorney, but was running the nonprofit, we approach, in Maine has an odd system, but adults and juveniles are both under the umbrella of the Department of Corrections. There's not a separation of juveniles and adults. The facilities there are, but just they're administered by the Department of Corrections. And for the Southern District of Maine, overseeing all the juvenile cases in Maine, by the name of Mike Mack, nice guy. And so for a couple of years, I'd bug him periodically. Oh, send us cases, blah, blah. And we'd get 1 or 2 every few months, and it disturbed me that he didn't see the wisdom of it. But I was flying out to Maine, and I thought, well, wait a minute. And how many of you taken like Kate Pranis's training? And if you know Kate Pranis, you know the medicine wheel, right? The 4 quadrants: get acquainted, develop relationships, issues, themes. Where do we go from here, right? And I'd love that. I just did a training last week, and I said, if you don't remember anything whatsoever from this day and a half, have this. And I gave everybody a sheet of the circle. And I thought, well, wait a minute. I've been doing circles for a while, using this approach faithfully. But why wouldn't I use it in relationships, And so I got off the plane, and I thought, I'm going to call Mike and go to coffee with him. And I'm not going to say a thing about restorative justice, not a thing, and see where the conversation goes. So we meet for coffee, hour and 15 minutes. We talk about his kids. Next month, or whenever I go back again, we talk about his wife, Then we talk about what he likes to read. The 5th time, Fred, tell me about this thing called restorative justice. Oh, okay. And it taught me a valuable lesson. We're such a transactional society, right? And we want to sell the thing, and we forget about developing the relationship part. After that 5th time of having coffee, we started getting cases. I didn't even have to ask. They started coming, So when we're approaching these systems people, I think we need to remember that they're human beings too. They have their own fears. They're afraid to give up cases. They're afraid to give up power. They don't want anything to go wrong. They're risk averse, all those things. So don't talk about the stuff yet. Talk about them. Let them talk about themselves, and develop the relationship so that you're not just some provider out in the community, that wants, that has this thing, So just, I don't know, for what it's worth, I think.
Well, you certainly have patience.
Well, when the guy says we're going to have a restorative justice system in 100 years, you can have patience.
Yeah. So I want to say one last thing, which besides the dispute resolution and Friends of Restorative Justice, we have 3 other organizations who helped co-sponsor these events, and they are the Michigan Collaborative to End Mass Incarceration, the Michigan Center for Youth Justice, and the Restorative Justice Group at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Ann Arbor, and we thank all of them. And so also thank everyone who was here this evening, and we will send you a link to the recording, and we will inform you about future events. So
I don't know what year it was, Kathy, but one of the 3 visits where I spent an evening at the Unitarian Church, I'll never forget. It was wonderful, just wonderful to be with all those people who, whether they knew much about it or not, understood, you know. In fact, that's how we got our Restorative Justice Center started in Portland, was with the Unitarian Church.
And that's what Janet Reedy started. She's not a Unitarian, she's a Mennonite, but that's where we met. Cold winter night in November, over 80 people came, and they didn't know what restorative justice was. Sorry to interrupt, but it was such a wonderful night. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed being with you again, and I recognize many faces and names. So, yeah.
Well, thank you.
It's a real honor to be with you. Yeah. Thanks. All right. We'll stay in touch.
A
Carol,
Zoom
good to
clap,
see
and
you.
hope to see you again soon. And
Okay. All right.
good night, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.